I'm here interviewing today the immediate past president of the New York State Bar Association, Hank Greenberg. He is a partner at the office of Greenberg in Albany, New York. Hank, good to see you.
Good to see you.
The point behind this is to kind of give a picture in time of the pandemic from the eyes of people living through it, particularly in the legal profession. Obviously, you had a very unique role here. You were on the second half of your presidency with the New York State Bar, and there was a lot of things that were occurring on top of the pandemic, namely in the political realm, that you were concentrated on, plus setting up for the handover in June. Can you give me a timeline for yourself as far as when things started kind of going awry on the pandemic side for you at NYS?
Sure. It was actually the last quarter of my presidency. So presidency in the New York State Bar Association runs from June 1 to May 31st. And I was nearing the last 3 months of my presidency, so let's just say March, April, May. And early March, I think, is when news reports started to intensify and a perception that things were going south around the country. I mean, we were reading about Italy, for example, and other countries around the world were, full-blown in the midst of the crisis. And memory serves, in early March, that's when we were starting to come to grips with what ultimately ended up enveloping our lives. What's kind of interesting is the last 3 months of a presidency, at least in the State Bar Association, is usually a downhill coast. You give a few speeches. I was going to take a trip to Madrid. I think London was in the cards. Give some talks around the state. Most of what you would hope to accomplish had already been launched and was well underway or in the midst of sort of wrapping up. Task forces, work groups, and other initiatives. And then I think in early March, we all collectively as a state and a nation began to read stories about COVID-19 with increasing frequency. I started to get requests to do interviews by the media. This is before the lockdown in New York State. But when it really hit home was when the governor issued his New York Pause, that's what it's called, New York Pause Executive Order, which went into effect March 22 at 8 p.m. Sunday. And that's when the lock-in order in New York State took effect. We can talk more about it, but that's when the New York State Bar Association went from a physical and an actual platform to a virtual one.
And obviously, one of your points on your presidency was to bring about a virtual bar center. There were speeches that were given early on in your term to that very end. Is it serendipity? Dumb luck?
Yeah, luck. Well, no oracular or prophetic gifts do I presume to have. Thinking about and talking about building a virtual bar center actually began even before my presidency. We had a meeting of the State Bar Association section leaders, I think in April or May of 2019. I took office June 1. And so I rolled out at that section leaders conference in the spring, and then repeated when I gave my first address to the House of Delegates as president in June of 2019, a speech that we entitled Building a Virtual Bar Center. And in brief, what it was a recognition that the association needed to enhance, reinvent, reimagine its technological capacity in order to better provide services, especially to millennials, young lawyers, and others, since so much of the world now lives online, and that's where so many of our members do. They live on social media, they live on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. That's where they consume so much news and other information about the world in which we live. And it was my belief that we as an association needed to take our technological foundation and platform, which really is dated back to the 1990s, and just give it a giant boost. And so we brought in consultants and made deep investments, never for a moment, never fathoming this once in a century pandemic that brought the state and nation and world to its knees. But good fortune smiled on us because our virtual bar center, our final finishing touches on our website and other components of our technological infrastructure were completed just a few weeks before COVID-19 struck. So when the virus hit, and when we all began to, as a state, start to cloister in our homes, we were in a position to take the State Bar Association from a physical to a virtual platform, and we're able to seamlessly provide the same services that we did previously before COVID-19, but we're able to do it electronically and digitally.
Obviously, there were certain things that had to be handled up front in the physical sense for NYSBA, but there was a lot of things that came out shortly after the pause went into effect in New York State that was headed by NYSBA, namely some of the task forces that were created, and later on some of the pro bono activities that had emerged as a result of the pandemic. Can you speak to the creation of those task forces and why they're important?
Well, I didn't pace myself very well. I was sort of thinking the last 3 months would be this downhill coast, and had worked intensely and at breakneck speed at other initiatives before March. But then when the pandemic hit, we sort of took a mindset that no crisis should go wasted. We knew we were in a crisis, and we were trying to figure out how we could effectively provide services to our members, to the profession, and to society writ large. And so for our staff at the State Bar Association, led by our Executive Director, Pam McDevitt, I think for them this was their finest hour. In a 143-year history of the association, I don't know that our professionals, our leaders, our officers, our executive committee have ever distinguished themselves as highly and as well as they did during the crisis. So our first instinct was to do what bar associations do pretty well. When there's a crisis, create a committee. As it happens, this crisis had so many branches and was so complicated that we created a lot of committees. So starting in April and May, we created a committee to assist law firms in reopening. We created a committee to address what we know will be, when the crisis passes and our courts are fully reopened, the most extraordinary surge in demand in legal services probably in American history, disproportionately impacting the poor and minorities. So we reached out to our chief judge and our chief administrative judge, Shannon T. Fiore and Larry Marks, to create a statewide pro bono network that would provide legal assistance to help meet the need from Niagara Falls to Montauk. And our legal service organizations, they do great work. Our legal aid societies do great work. But there was no way, given what we expect in terms of the demand for services and the surge for services, that they could be met by legal aid societies. So with the chief judge, we created a task force led by former Chief Judge Jonathan Littman that began to put in place the pieces of a statewide pro bono network, our first initiative in that respect, partnering not only with the court system, but with our current governor, Andrew Cuomo, and his staff was to create a pro bono network for people whose claims for unemployment insurance were denied. We're now experiencing in New York depression-era levels of unemployment. Anywhere between 1.5 million and 2 million New Yorkers are out of work, depending on what economist or who you listen to. Unemployment in New York is anywhere between 15 to 30%. So we created a pro bono network to help people who submitted claims for unemployment insurance and were denied, to assist them through the pro bono, through the appeal process. We created another pro bono network that is addressing people who are the immediate victims of COVID-19 and who have lost their lives, to help families deal with the process of their wills and their estates. We are also in the process of creating another pro bono network that began before I left office, and it's continuing, that will address the needs of all of these people who are unemployed, who can't pay their rent because they don't have the money to pay that rent. Inevitably, they will be the subject of eviction proceedings. And landlords are suffering as well. Small landlords might not have rent paid in months and months. They have to keep the lights on. So we're providing pro bono assistance to tenants and others. That was another committee we created. We've just created a series of task forces and committees to respond to the crisis. One other thing that we did that was extraordinary from the point of view of the staff, how they pulled this off. But we were determined, as soon as we went into lockdown March 22, to take this digital and virtual bar center and transform it into a COVID-19 resource center. And so all of our communications platforms and outlets, social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, email, was transformed into a COVID-19 resource information center, blasting out to our members the latest executive order from Governor Cuomo, news stories, other guidance provided by various agencies, state and federal, trying to meet the immediate needs of our membership. And in that spirit, one of the, actually two of the constituencies that the State Bar Association has served, which have suffered most profoundly during this crisis, is the class of 2020. Those are graduating law students and small and solo practitioners. With respect to the class of 2020, I'm not so old that I don't remember when I graduated from law school in the late 1980s, the two things that were foremost in my mind. One was getting a job and the other was passing the bar exam. And for the class of 2020 during COVID-19, they are suffering mightily. Law firms began to rescind offers. The job market, along with the rest of the economy, became grimmer and grimmer, especially for graduating law students. And the bar exam, it was evident in March and April, could not be administered in July, which is the traditional time when the summer bar exam is administered, which in New York, the exam is taken by more than 10,000 law students. So we had already an existing task force on the New York State Bar Exam, chaired by the presiding justice of the Appellate Division 2nd Department, Alan Shankman. And I charged them to immediately make recommendations about how the state should address, and most notably the New York Court of Appeals, our highest court, which is responsible for making decisions in relationship to the bar exam, along with our State Board of Law Examiners. So I tasked Judge Shankman and this blue ribbon task force to make immediate recommendations, and they recommended, one, the July bar exam be terminated that date, since it couldn't be held owing to the crisis, and be re-administered in September. And secondly, they recommended that the Court of Appeals should be issuing practice orders that would allow graduating law students to practice law for a period of time under the supervision of an experienced lawyer, with the understanding that they would eventually have to take and pass the bar exam. And I could not be prouder that the recommendations of this task force which were issued in April, were adopted by our state's highest court in less than a day. Another constituency that suffered greatly from COVID-19 and still do were solo and small firm practitioners. Big law, large law firms are likely to fare well through this crisis. They have deep reserves that they can draw on. They can create task forces and commissions. They can repurpose themselves, to emphasize certain services likely to be more readily accessed post-COVID-19 than other services. But for solo practitioners and small firm practices that don't have deep reserves, they have been devastated. There are lawyers that have spent years and decades building solo and small firm practices only to watch in the blink of an eye their life's work collapse. So in response to that crisis, we created an emergency task force to address the needs of solo and small firm practices, which were convened and began to meet many times each week and spewed out a series of recommendations, areas for which we should seek and urge the governor and the legislature to take action to address the needs of these lawyers. So as you can imagine, we have been, during the last 3 months of my presidency, they were clearly the busiest 3 months of my presidency.
Certainly. And knowing you as I do, I can't have a conversation about this without looking at the historical bent. I know you've always kind of put things in a historical lens, as do I. Did you give any thought to that? I mean, I realize there was a lot of things happening all at once, but that had to have entered your mind at some point.
It was. You know me very well. I was, not only do I love history, in a past life I was a former general counsel of the New York State Department of Health, which has responsibility for public health issues and dealing with pandemics. So that experience informed a lot of what I was doing. I'll say a couple of things about history. I had read, even before the crisis, books about, the great influenza of 1918 and 1919, which is comparison to what we're living with today, had an even more catastrophic impact on the state, nation, and world, even than COVID-19. Some estimates are 50 million people died around the globe because of the great influenza, sometimes called the Spanish flu. So I was very aware of that history. It's over 100 years ago, and the impact on New York State. So I was mindful of that. And as a former general counsel of the health department, I had the benefit of being able to draw on sort of my knowledge and information about, the legal regime that can be accessed by the governor, by state and local health commissioners to address pandemics. So that was very helpful. Helpful in terms of, both addressing and coming up with initiatives to deal with the immediate crisis. But the other thing, Sarah, I will tell you that gives me great hope from a knowledge of history is that the great influenza of 1918, which struck in the winter of 1918, there was a second wave in the fall of 2019. Some estimates are 500,000 New Yorkers lost their lives because of that contagion. It passed. It did pass. And knowing something about epidemics throughout world history, including the bubonic plague, what Europe dealt with in the 15th century and the 16th century, it passes. And so just going back to the great influenza of 1918 and 1919, which again had a catastrophic impact on the state, nation, and world, by 1920, the Roaring Twenties came about, and the world barely looked in the rearview mirror. The economy resurged, there was a resurgence in the economy, in society. So this thing I know for certain, this too shall pass. The current crisis will pass. And the lies we once knew will come back to us. It is my hope as a former bar leader that there will be lessons that are learned. One of the things that I did before I left was I tasked our health law section to do a deep dive on the law vis-a-vis COVID-19 and make recommendations in light of the crisis about areas where the law could be improved. Unbelievably, in the middle of a global pandemic, leaders within the health law section in 2 months' time produced a report over 80 pages long with more than 300 footnotes, sort of addressing future pandemics and crises and how we might learn from what we're dealing with so that we're better equipped to deal with this when again this ever happens. Let's hope it's another century or more from today. So again, I draw optimism from my knowledge of history. I know this will pass. I also know when we get out on the other side of COVID-19, some things will be different. We can talk more about that if you'd like. Some tendencies and trends that were underway before COVID-19 have been accelerated exponentially, and we'll see the impact of that exponential change in certain trends and tendencies, most notably technology. But Sarah, I am certain in the future, and it won't be the very distant future, we will look back on this piece of history that we have lived with. Hopefully we will have learned the lessons of COVID-19, but our old lives will return to us. Of that, I am certain.
And to segue into my next question, looking at it now that you're past presidency, obviously there was a transition naturally going to occur for you. What does the practice of law look like for you now as past president, but also in the current circumstances?
A couple of things. One is being president of the State Bar, the New York State Bar Association, which is the oldest and largest voluntary bar association in the country. It's pretty close to a full-time job. We have clients, I have clients that we kept in touch with and tried to assist and support throughout the year, but it was all consuming. And the last 3 months, it was a full-time job and then some. So I returned to work. My presidency ended on May 31, and I'm back in my law firm. You can see it. Back in my office now all the time. Reconnecting with some of my clients who now know I'm back on the job 24/7. They can get me anytime. The other thing I think that's grown out of the experience, though, is that some of the successes we had in partnership with the state court system and our chief judge and our chief administrative judge led to the formation of a commission to reimagine the future of New York courts, which I have the privilege of chairing. We're having this conversation in early July. So in a way, it's not the New York State Bar Association, but I'm doing that kind of work, and I'm thrilled and honored to have the opportunity to, apply some of the lessons that we've learned during this period of COVID-19, and now thinking about how to reimagine the future of our state courts and position the state courts in a way that, here we are. We've completed the first fifth of the 21st century. Put the court system in a place where it's able to sort of leverage these changes in technology and other changes within society so they're in a better position to increase access to justice, provide more efficient administrative services, and focus on the needs of the customers of our court system, which are the litigants.
Very good.